I'm going to take you through the very first part of importing data into Donman, a very common thing that lots of organizations need to do because we get data from many and varied sources nowadays. So understanding the imports and why there are so many different programs is because even though in Donman there are many varied programs used to import different sorts of data into Donman, some are straight names, addresses, some are donation files, some have a whole lot of different stuff in them. So that for just about everything that you want to import, if it's sort of outside of the general import program or things like that, you would normally have a program written specifically, because even though we have a peer-to-peer module as an example in Donman, there are 3 different programs to read the 3 different sorts of data that we get. One from Everyday Hero, from GoFundRaise, and MyCourse are the 3 that we sort of support in that at the moment. So what we're going to look at initially are the general import program, which is really used for importing contact details, names, addresses, things like that. So it can be used to import data directly, so we can import new records, or we can use it to update existing records. And the other thing I'll then be looking at is using the standard Read Web Donation program, which will be on your donation processing menu. Okay, so give me a second. I'll just get into Donman. Okay, so in order to get to the general import program, I need to go through the Start menu, through your menu, and then you'll get to Modify History Archive. Now, I think just about everyone knows the password for that particular menu, but this is the only place in the system that can actually delete or archive a donor record. When you're in this menu, you should have this entry here, which is the General Import Program. As I said, when we run this program, it does give me an option at the very top here to say, do you want to add or update records? So for the first time I'm going to go through this, I'm just going to add records from the spreadsheet. So the most normal thing or common thing that we sort of get is people have said, oh, here's a spreadsheet of data, and I want you to put it into your database. Okay, so someone's been through and they've done a whole lot of lovely things to it. They've put colors on it. They've done a whole lot of stuff. So as it is, I can't use the file as a straight Excel file, because the Excel file contains all of the different variables or attributes I've got on these cells. So it'll have the colors, whether it's centered, left, whether it wraps, whatever it is. I'll have a whole lot of different options there. So from Excel, the first thing I need to do is save it. In this case, if I save it to my disk, so in this case, my W drive is my Donman folder. So then I'll go into DM Work, and I then have to change it down the bottom here. And so what I'm looking for is a tab delimited text file. You can also use CSV, but sometimes you'll get commas in data, and that can sort of throw your fields out. So tab is normally what we'd recommend to people. It's a very nice, clean format. So if I say that and say, yes, I want to save it now, in this case, I'm just going to call it Import Test, and it's going to be in my DM Work folder. If I save it, Excel is going to come up and say, in this case, it's already there. Do I want to replace it? So I can say yes. And then Excel is going to have a little complaint to say, I'm not saving it as an Excel file. So if I just say yes, I can then close Excel. I don't need to save again. You can just close that. And from there, I can now go back to Donman and say, I've now got the text file in place, and I can read that in. So from the Excel sheet, I've got the text file. I'm now going to say I'm going to add records to my database. From there, if you've got the prospect system for Donman, you'll get an option to do either donors or prospects. If you don't, and lots of organizations don't have the prospect system, by default it'll just put D for donor file. From there, whether it's comma or tab delimited, and as I said, out of Excel, normally save it as a tab delimited file, skip the first row because it's got the field names in, and from there, have I done a backup? Because potentially I could be reading in, thousands of records at any time, and if something goes horribly wrong, I need to be able to back up the data in order to cover that. So normally on your network, the system would be part of the normal server backup. If perchance it's not, or you just wanted to make sure, you can go into the DM Work folder and right-click on the data folder, and there's an option that will come up that says add to a compressed zip folder. If you do that, you need to make sure that all the users are out of Donman, otherwise some of the files won't be included properly. But that will give you an immediate backup of the data before we start. So I've already done that in this case, so I'm going to say, yes, I have done a backup. From there, it's now asking me the acquisition date for the records. By default, it's today's date. What donor type? So if you've got files that have got a mixture of donors as individuals and donors as organizations, I would normally split them into two different files and do two different imports. So then I can choose here whether it's an individual or a organizational sort of read that I'm doing. From there, you then have the source code. And if you don't have a source code in your list at the moment to suit, then we need to create that before we actually start doing the import. So in this case, I'm just going to say that they will come from a radio ad. Okay. If there's an extra code I want to attach to all of those records, and what mail code I want them to have. So these are all the default values for the records that we read in. So in this case, I'm just going to say that they're on one of my mailing lists. From there, the system will then take me down, where I can then choose the file. Okay, so if I go into DM Work, okay, so you can now see I've got my import test file, which is the one I saved out of Excel. So by default, this will look at text files, but you can, if you sit there, it'll say no, they're only text files, but if you had CSV files, they'll also show up. So in this case, that's my file. When I enter, the system will automatically create an assignment file, which will make more sense when we get to the next page. It's basically how we marry up the fields. So if I were getting a file that was in the same format, on a regular basis, I could set up a field assignment that was already matched up those fields. If I know what the fields are in Donman, and I rename them in the spreadsheet before I save it as text, makes it much easier when you do the import because everything will pretty much line up straight away. If the file's in all uppercase, hopefully that's not what you get, but it can be, then you can say yes, and the system will do its best to change the case of the records as it reads them in. In this case, looking at the data that I had, it's saying no, they weren't in uppercase. In this case, I don't want to do a trial run, but you can do a trial run if you just wanted to sort of go through the motions and find out how many duplicates or potential duplicates there were in your database against the external file that you're doing. So in this case, no, it's not a trial run. The system's showing me here that it's going to create two files. One's called an import error file, and the other one is an import log file of what has actually happened. Okay. From there, I have two options. One that says decide on dupes by the email, and decide on dupes by the name and the postcode. So normally you'd have yes to both of these so that you can maximize the potential for trapping dupes. Because the last thing we want to do, of course, is read in lots of duplicates. The next one says you want to update duplicates, pick, or skip. If you knew that the data that you were reading in was, very up to date, so the addresses are all 100% correct, etc., then you might say here, I want to update those records. So when it goes through the motions of importing the data and stops and says, hold on, here's a potential duplicate, if I choose them, it'll then update the record from the data that's in the spreadsheet. If I say skip, it just won't import that record. If I said, look, that record's already in my database. Okay. Down the bottom here, it's all showing you that all new records created or updated will be in a selection file called import that you can then use to do something else with the records in bulk. So if you wanted to add them to mailing lists or do anything else to them, you've got something that you can use straight away. So down the bottom of the screen now, just enter to continue, and that puts me onto the next screen where you can see I've got the fields in my Donman structure are on the left here, and the ones on the right are what they're called in the actual text file. So in this case, title is matched up, but name one hasn't. So if I click on the drop down, and I said, well, from what I've looked at the data, you've got every field, so I say I'm looking for first name to match that up to. So even though it's not called exactly the same, at this point here, you can just marry up the fields. Okay, so last name goes to surname, address 1 will go to street 1. Okay. Same for address 2, street 2. Okay, suburb, state, postcode have all married up straight away. So then I've got mobile. So for the phones, they're all phone something. So in this case, I can match up phone mobile, phone home. Okay. Or if you had a field perchance in the text file that you didn't want to read, you can just delete the value even if it's matched, and that'll come up and say not read. So from there, I've now got all of my fields matched up from the text file into where I want the data to end up in the Donman field. So from there, if I just enter, when you do this, you can see there's still lots of spare fields in this particular case. So you can have up to 33 fields, which for contact details, like for name, address, phone numbers, and other things you might have on a record, should be far and away plenty of fields. Okay. From there, it's now saying, am I ready to begin? So if I say yes, that'll start going through the motions. So in this case, it's telling me I've got a donor here, which is Margaret Preston, and here the record that I'm reading in is Peter. So there we can see why the possible duplicates come up. In this case, if I said no, it's not the same person, I can just push the escape button on the keyboard or just click on the cancel button, and that will then import that record. Okay, so the same sort of thing here. It's come up with the next one, was saying Rose Smythe, who's in Gregors Creek 4313, is a possible duplicate for this. So in this case, the names are similar. So Smith and Smythe are very similar, and they happen to be in the same postcode. So this isn't then alerting me that even though the address isn't 100% correct or matched, it's saying there is enough things to work on to say, look, this is a potential duplicate. So again, in this case, it's not. So I can say that's fine, just cancel. Okay, the same sort of thing. Come up with the next one where I've now got William Gray in the same postcode, so same suburb postcode in this case, but obviously the name is different. Okay, so now it's come up with a duplicate saying, oh, hold on, here's a donor already on the system that may be there, but you can see the address I've got in my database here is different from the one that I'm reading in. So because I said on the previous screen that I want to update those records, when I choose this one, so I choose this one, say yes, that's the duplicate. It's now saying confirm that, so I can say yes, okay, and it will then updated the record in Donman. Okay, so the same sort of thing here. I've got this person here and this person here. So if I want to update the record, so yes. If the name had just happened to be the same, but the address was totally different, and I couldn't 100% say it's the same person, then I would click on cancel to create a new record, because I can't, and I don't want to muck up an existing donor record if I'm not 100% sure. If we find out later that they were duplicates and it was, they've moved or whatever's happened, then I can always merge the records later. But at this point, it's too dangerous a decision because I haven't got all the information available while I'm doing this process. So in this case, I'm going to say yes. Okay, so now I've got two people here. And in this case, I think what it's looking at is the actual email address is the same on both records. So even if the name is not the same or whatever it might be, it's now doing a check based on, the, as we saw on the screen before, on the emails or the name. And so in this case, I'm saying no, because this one's Catherine and the other record is Mick. So again, just cancel, and that will read them in. So at the end of the import, you'll get this screen here basically showing you anything that's come up. So it's got here that I had the potential duplicates for Peter and Margaret. So even though I didn't say that is an existing donor, it's alerted me to that. If I then close that one, I'll now get the log file showing me all of the things that the system has done. Okay? If there's anything that was totally wrong, etc., I'll be able to see those as well. So once I've done that, that's basically imported my data. So if I now go back to my normal donor entry and page up, will take me to the last record in the system. Okay, so now I can see here's the records that I've read in to the system. Okay, so based on the codes or whatever it is that I might have had, it's basically imported all that data. If I look down here, though, I can see the mobile number I didn't take care of when I was in the spreadsheet, because that's not how I want the mobile to be. And one of the downfalls of Excel is that if I have mobile numbers specifically or even our phone numbers that have got 0 in the front, if I don't do some formatting on it, Excel does what Excel does, and it will take the 0 off the front of those numbers. Okay. So what I could then do is create a list out of Donman of all the people where all I really need is their donor number in the mobile fields or the other phone number fields, and I can then put that into Excel, format it, and then read the data back in again. So that takes us to the next part of what we can do with the general import program. So if I get out of there, so in this case I've already created a file in Excel that has got basically those two fields. If I get back into Excel, okay, so from VisRep is normally the easiest way to do this. So as I go through, you can see all I've got is, in this case, the donor number and the mobile phone. Okay. So you can see Excel, for all of these ones that don't have a space in them, has basically taken the 0 off the front and trashed it on me. So what I want to do is be able to fix those up fairly easily and pull it back in again. Mobiles is the easiest field of all to sort of do this to. If I highlight all my mobile fields, the mobile numbers, Excel has a nice facility where I can then right-click, go to Format Cells. If I then go down to Custom and click in here, so I want the first one to have a 0, and then I want 3 hashes. So 3 hashes represents 3 numbers. As you can see, the same sort of thing down here on all the standard formats. So then again, space 3, space 3, and then OK. So in this case, all of my mobile numbers are dodgy, of course, and they've all got extra digits. Okay, so they've all got 1 extra digit that they shouldn't have. So if I said, I want it to actually look like it's supposed to look, so it's, starting with 0, I can go through, because when you're playing with dummy data, of course, it's always a little bit tougher. And I'm just going to find the 1 to 0, 0, and replace with 1, 0, and see if that gets me closer to where I want to be. Okay, so you can see, though, I'm not getting 100% the results that I'd normally have, but as soon as I've changed that formatting, the 0 has come back on the front of the records. So because when I did the formatting and I put the hashes in, if the numbers exceed that, it's just going to say, no, bad luck, that's how it's going to be. If I save it like that, so you can see up the top here, the number is still that. Until I actually save it out of Excel, I'm not going to have the numbers on the front. Okay? So if I were to take the spaces out of this one, okay, so again I've got that same problem where I'm now losing my 0, but I've got spaces in there, and in this case it's purely because I've got 1 digit too many in the numbers. Okay, so if I have all the right number of digits, the format is going to be exactly how I want it to be, just like that one. Okay. So for this one, I'm just going to copy the same number down because these aren't real records, and the number is not that relevant. Okay. So if I had all my numbers correct and I had all the formatting correct, okay, so they would all be in that same sort of format. From there, I'd say, beautiful, I've got all my mobile numbers sorted out. I can then do File, Save As, and in this case I'm going to call it Mobile Phone Import. And that way I've got my original file, so if something goes wrong, I can always go back to the original. I haven't sort of modified it and mucked it up totally. So again, save that into your DMWorks directory, because in this case it was already a text file. I didn't have to do the Save As like I did on the previous file. Okay. So once I've done that, again we get out of Excel. I go back into my Modify History Archive menu and back into the General Import program. So in this case, I'm going to choose Update Existing Records. Again, it's the donor file. It's tab delimited. Skip the first row because that's got all the field names in. Pardon me. And again, yes, I've done a backup. So in this case, because I've got the phone numbers in the original export file and I've saved the ones I'm going to read into a separate import file, that is as good as I need for a backup, because worst case I could read the original numbers back in and go, okay, now I'm back to where I started, because I've still got the donor numbers and the phone numbers. So in this case, because I'm doing an update, it's now skipping in the middle here because it's not creating new records, so these aren't necessary. So just like we did before that, I've now got my import file. The structure will be created again where it's got the field assignment file. So if I go through, so now I'm not doing a test run, you can see in this case, again, because I'm doing update at the top here, it has skipped these fields here about doing duplicate checking because it's not relevant. Okay, so enter. Because in this case, I've got donor NO as how the data has come out, and I need to make sure that that goes into the donor number field. Okay, just choose the field, and phone number will line up straight away. So again, if I change that in the spreadsheet while I had it in Excel to how it should be, I don't have to worry about changing it in Donman. But if it ever says not read, just try and validate. Sometimes you might need to go back to the spreadsheet and actually look and see what data's in there in order to make sure you've got the right field. So in this case, I've got the two fields, again, ready to begin. Okay, so very quick. So it just basically goes through telling me it's read 170 records, tells me all the donors that were found and updated. And if I now go back to my donor entry screen, okay, so I can now see that the mobiles, so because I had the mobiles all stuffed basically, okay, so now I'm getting to the ones where I had all the mobile numbers the same. Okay, so you can see that the format then is the way that I want it to be, even though in this case the number itself is all the same, and that wouldn't be the case in your normal data. But very easy to use the general import program to append to existing data. So even if you were choosing or doing some data cleanup and you said it's too much or too many changes that I want to do on each record, and if I do the bulk code change or any of those other facilities that are also in Donman to do that, I can export the data, do the cleanup, and as long as I've got the donor number, I can import that data back in. Okay, so in my case, I've still got numbers from the ones that I read in at the end of the file that are in the wrong format, so I could do the same sort of thing. I'd find the first donor number and then say I want to do a report from VisRep looking at donor number 179 or greater, and again export the donor number, the mobile field, put it into Excel, format them the way I want, and then use the general import to sort of update those records. So hopefully that's sort of given you a bit of an insight into doing the general import program, and that can then be used for either creating new records or existing records. Okay. So the next part we're going to look at is more the general web donation. So this is where if you've got a web page that is hosted by us, we know the format of the data. So that way you can then have the generic import program to read that in. There are primarily two programs to do that. For most of the web pages now, they're in an XML format, which means when you get the data and you log on to the website, it's basically in a format where it's got all the XML data. It's not in a text file at all. So it's totally different. So if I go into donation processing, for most of the people that have now got peer-to-peer, etc., because the donation processing menu itself was getting very busy and had lots of entries on it, we've now, and normally what we do is create this new menu on the left here for web donations, and this allows us then to put in all the different web donation programs that you might have, and it also allows us to do future expansion. So if there's more programs that become, say, part of the peer-to-peer structure or whatever it might be, we can certainly then just add those to this menu without having to muck up the main processing menu. The other advantage of that is that my processing menu can then become fairly clean, where these are, for the daily processing, the parts of the cycle that I need to start at, and I finish at the bottom. So for this one, we'll go back into web donations, and I'm going to look at import web donations, which is the standard XML file import. From there, the system will ask me straight away, where's the file? And you can see the extension on the file is XML. So from the web page, you then save the data or the page that you see it as an XML file. And for most organizations, it's easier if you create under your DM work folder, create a folder called Web Donate or Web Don, and that way you can put them in there. When you do the web donations, they always have a batch number on them, and that's generated from the web page itself. So normally I just number them up sequentially, and for all purposes, once you've read the files in and you know everything's good, you don't need to keep these XML files. You can just delete them. Okay. So in this case, I'm just going to choose this last file here. Okay. If you've got Gateway on your system, then the decryption key is fairly irrelevant. If you haven't, where the credit card numbers are stored as encrypted numbers, for your website you will have a decryption key which basically converts the encrypted number back into the credit card number, so we can actually use it for banking or just recording into the system. From there, if I've got a campaign code that's actually in the data, I need to make sure that that's already set up in Donman so that the donations can match up straight away. If perchance I've got a campaign on the website that's not set up in Donman yet, when I go to import the data, I'll get an error saying this donation wasn't put in because it couldn't find a campaign matching what was in the data. So in this case, I'm just saying that if it's not designated in the actual XML file or from the web page, I'm just going to use the general donation campaign. And again, you'll have all of your campaigns you can choose from to say this is what I want. But normally once you go through this process the first time and you set up the actual entries in the fields that you want, as far as which campaigns in this case, they will stay and become part of the structure from there on. And then I'm saying if there are pledge records, then I'm going to use my campaign, which is just called auto deduct. From there, if we do if you wanted to have a donation type on the transactions as you import them, depending on if you're using that field or not, you can then again choose that from the drop-down list. Okay, so I might have one in there that says these are just donations, or it might be web donations or something like that, just to give you something extra to know that later on I can report on how much money came in for a particular campaign via the web as opposed to how much came through the actual office. So for this particular one, I'm saying no, I don't need to use the donation type. For new records that are created, we're then saying for the majority of them, they're going to be individuals. The source code on the donors, I'm going to create a web, so they come from the web donation, and they're going to have a mail code so that they're on my mailing list. If I wanted to attach an extra code, again, to all of these people, I've got the option to do that, so I can go through. In this case, I'm just going to use test 1 as the code to put on. Okay. If an address is incomplete, the system will then say, what do you want to make the mail code? And normally, if it's an incomplete address or it doesn't have enough detail, you'd make the record no mail by default so that they're not going to get picked up when you do the mailings later. Okay. If there's no name, address, or available, which shouldn't normally happen because most of these fields are mandatory, you can't unfortunately stop people from just putting in A, B, C, D, E, F, G or something like that because there's no way to check that it's actually a real name. So sometimes you will still get rubbish data from websites where people really are making a donation but they don't want to be known. From there, it's saying if there is no name or address available, I can then credit the donor, the donation to a particular donor number. So in this case, if I choose donor 1, and you can see down the bottom here, it's telling me that that is my anonymous donor. Okay, so whatever your record you've got set up for those sort of miscellaneous funds, just anonymous donations that can't be credited to an actual individual or an organization, normally they all go to one record. Okay. Has the batch been banked already? And that would purely depend on how the money's being transacted online. So if you're using a gateway, then yes, they would have been banked already. If you're not, then you say no, they haven't been, so they will become part of your banking for that day. So in this case, the file I've got is using the gateway, so I don't need to bank this money. So I can say yes, it's already been banked. Just like the import file, there's an error file that will be created and a log file. So all of the programs that we use to import data will just always create these two files. And on the screen it will tell you for your program what it's going to do. So exactly the same like we had on the general import program, we've got an option here to decide by GIPS, by email, and by similar name and postcode. So normally you would always say yes, because again we want to minimize the number of duplicates. Okay, so down the bottom again, have I done a recent backup, and am I ready to begin? So once I get to there, if there's any errors, it'll come up fairly much straight away. So from there, it's telling me I'm running the same file twice because it's basically got the same name as one I did previously. So in this case, I'm going to say that's fine. Okay, Now it's come up with the first duplicate saying this is the person that it's reading in, and I can see here that that is a person already on my system. So I'm going to choose that as the existing donor. Yes. So as it's reading the records in, so again I can see this one's Jenny Andrews and this one's Jennifer Andrews. Okay. The address is the same, so it's just that the record has been put in slightly different on the website. So if I said, well, yes, again, that is the same person. So yes. Okay. So it will then update that record from the name that it had to the one that I've imported. Okay. So in this case, very small read. I've only got three records. Okay, and how many donors are found by the operator as a duplicate. So if I needed to, I can print that out if there's any errors on there that I needed to address. You know, like if there's a field that the data wouldn't fit in or something like that, they're the sorts of things I'll get on the error file. If I just close that down, I'll then get to the log file. Okay, so you can see anything that has happened as far as where it's changed a mobile number or where it's changed email, etc. You'll get all of those. And as I said, if it's changed the name from Jennifer to Jenny, okay, because that's basically come in from the data. So if I close both of those, that's finished the actual web donation import. If I go back home, in this case, and and going to record donations. So what basically the web donation import has done for me is circumvent this step here. So I don't need to create the donors and I don't need to do the manual entry of the transactions, but depending on whether they've gone through the gateway or whether they still need to be banked, I would then follow the normal sequence of events to finish off my donation processing for those. Okay. So normally, okay. So down the bottom of the menu, you can see that the progress says it's donations, and there's now 5 donations in the temporary file. Okay, so there were 2 donations that were there already, and the 3 that I've just imported from the web. So if I had more donations to enter for the day, I could go back into record donations and just carry on and do a new batch, and then from there just carry on with a normal cycle. But just like the general import, and as Murray will show you some of the other sort of import programs, and there are many, many import programs in the system, we'll show you some of those things. But duplicate checking, of course, is one of the big things that always has to happen because we don't want to create lots and lots of duplicate records as we go through. So I'll hand over to Murray now, and he'll run through some additional sort of imports that you can do. So away to you, Murray.
Thanks, Gary. Hello, everyone. Okay, I'm going to go through a couple of the important ones that may be of use to you, and I'll also discuss some of the other programs that we have without actually going into any great detail about them. Some of those imports are only used under certain circumstances, perhaps if you're dealing with certain external bodies. The first one I'll have a look at is the bulk note program, so that if you want to import different notes for different people, you can set up a text file to do that. After that, I'll have a look at the Import All program, which allows you to create records in any file in Donman, but as it says on here, it's a very dangerous program. And I'll also talk about the old Read Web program. Gary's just finished talking about the Read Web program for our current files, but I'll also go through the old one because under some circumstances that can be quite useful. So to start off with the bulk note program, I'm just going to go into a file here that I've created. So this file is very simple. It's basically got a donor number and it's got some text. And so in each case, for that donor number, I'm going to add this text to it. So instead of being able to put the same text against everybody in a selection file, this way I can actually do different text for different people. So I've already saved that, but as Gary said before, you can save that as a text file, and we suggest the tab delimited file. Now that's already been saved away. So the bulk note program probably doesn't exist on any of your menus, but if it's one that you do actually wish to use, we can add it to any menu that you like. In my case, I've actually added it to one of the bulk utility programs menu, so I'm just going to go into there. So like before, everybody knows the password to get into the Modify History Archive menu. Now I've actually added mine to bulk utility menu number 2 because bulk utility menu is actually full. We can't put anything more in there at the moment. So by going into bulk utility menu number 2, just using the same password, I've got this thing here called bulk import notes. So it's a very simple program, and like anything that we do in bulk, it will always ask us if we've got a backup, because if we haven't, then it will throw us out. Now that means that if we start to do some things and we muck it up, if we have our backup, then we can always restore. Bearing in mind, of course, that if you do this at the end of the day and you muck things up and you have to go back to your restore from last night, you will lose all of the work that you've done today. Anyway, so I'm going to say yes, I've got my backup from my file here. I've got the bulk note, that's what I've called it. Okay, oh, what happened there? Maybe it's being a bit slow. Okay, it's just being a bit slow. Okay, does the first line contain just headings? Do I have a header row? Yes, I do. And I can now choose which of my 4 notepads I want that to go into. I'll just let that go into the general notepad, the first one. Okay, do I want this to be at the beginning or end of your notepad? Now, typically most organizations will either add new notes to the top of the notes file, or they'll add it to the bottom. I'll add it to the bottom, so I'll say, no, I don't want to add it to the beginning. Do I want to put today's date on those? Yes, I'll do that. And then, yes, I do want to begin. Okay, so very, very fast. Now, what I can do is I can go back to my done entry, and I put these on the first people. So here's my, oh, actually it wasn't that one. Number 1, J, be good. And if I go to notes, here's the extra one that I added today. Spoke to Johnny about contributing to our talent night. He will think about it. Yes, I don't want to save that. And then if I go to my second one and have a look at the note that I added, of course, this has got a completely different note. Now, we do actually have a program that can add the same note to everybody in a selection file. I don't really consider that to be an import, but that's in your bulk utility menu. I'll just show you that very briefly. So if I just go to bulk utility programs, and then we've got the, no, I'm sure it's in there somewhere, bulk add notes. So that will add the same note that you type in to anybody in a selection file. So it is a very useful facility. You might get somebody to type up a whole lot of notes for each person and then assign a donor number, and then you can just simply import that with them, not necessarily having to know how to do that in Donman or how to add those notes. Now, the second program that I'm going to speak about does not exist on any menu. It's called Import All, and it is a very dangerous program. It does allow you to create records in any file in Donman. It does no validity checking whatsoever. So if you put in some value for a code that doesn't actually exist, it will just simply import that for you anyway. It's very similar to the generic import program, so when we run through it, you'll see a lot of similarities with what Gary's already shown you before. At the moment, it doesn't allow you to update existing records, but a change has been made and was actually sent to me this morning, but it's yet to be tested, so that may be an option in the future. But the trouble is that if you create rubbish data, then that's what your database is going to consist of. So I would suggest that unless you know exactly what you're doing with this, don't use it. At the moment, you're going to have to go in via the System Utilities menu, and of course for the System Utilities menu, you need to actually then have the daily password for it. All right. Now, if you are trying to use this to do something that you are doing regularly, then it may be better to actually have a program specifically written for that. The example that I'm going to use today is the volunteer activity file. Now, the volunteer activity file allows you to record any time that a donor might, or a volunteer might do some work for you. So they might come into the shop, or you might have a function on where you've got maybe 20 or 30 people who have all put in 5 hours of work attending to that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go in via the System utilities menu, if I can remember what the password was. No, it wasn't that then. I'll just try one other. No? Okay, well I'm going to go in a slightly different way and run a donor management program, and it's called Import AL. So the first thing it asks me is, what file do I want to actually import into? Now, because I've actually run through this as a bit of a trial, it's remembered what I've had from last time. So the VOLACT is the volunteer activity file. I've done mine as a tab delimited file. Yes, it does have a header row. Do I have a recent backup? Yes. And it's actually remembered the name of my file from when I was doing some testing. So let's go and have a look at that volunteer activity file. So this is it in a spreadsheet. So essentially what I've included is the donor number, the date of the activity, any comment. So I've only just put a comment against one person, that's donor number 11. If it was associated with a particular function, I could put the name of the function there, the number of hours, my initials as the operator, and the area in which those people have done the work. Now, as I said, there is no validity checking whatsoever. So if there was no code for kitchen, as in KIT, it would still import it, and your record would then have an invalid code on it. Same thing if I put something in the function code there as well. In fact, it won't even check, I don't think, to see if those donor records exist. It will just simply create that record. So I'm now going back into it, and I can now select VOLACT as the file, and like with the normal import program, it creates this import assignment file, which keeps track of which fields in my data file go into the volunteer activity file. Okay. No, it's not in uppercase. Yes, to continue. Okay, so again, this is very similar to what you've seen with Gary with the normal import program. I've made sure that everything is there. So if I say, yes, I'm ready to begin, it's now imported that data. Now, there was only 5 or 6 records there, so it was very fast. If I now go and have a look at my donors, so here's my first one, I can click on the dollar here, and we can see now that there's volunteer hours, and you can see he worked in the kitchen for 2.5 hours, and he did a fantastic job. So this is a great little program for importing certain types of records, but because you're going to need a password from us, I would suggest that you always need to be talking to us, at least in the first couple of instances when you run it, to ensure that you have all the right data. If you import some data and you miss out some fields, then it could be a lot of painful manual work to update those records. So again, it is useful. It's not good for things like transaction data, so you would never use it to import donations, because it'll just create the donation records. It won't update the stats on the donor record. It won't update the stats on the campaign record. It won't do any of that sort of stuff. If it's a pledge record that you're importing, it won't do anything like that at all. Now, the last program that I'm actually going to go through in detail is it's the old read web program. Initially, web downloads were as what I would call a flat file or a straight text file, unlike the current XML files. I've added this to my menu under the web donations as old read web program. Now, this is a very quirky program, and it demands that the data that you import is in a specific format. So what I've got here is a spreadsheet that shows you that format, but the actual file that you import will not even have a header. Looking at the date field there, you can see it's actually in American format, and that's the way that it needs to be. You've got the basic details here of names, position, all of that sort of stuff. As I go across, you can tell it what the campaign's going to be, the amount, the pay method, and I've just put dummy as the card name, because this was originally written just for credit cards off the web, but you can change the pay method. There are some fields in here that you need to know the type. So donation type of 1 means it's just a one-off donation. With the pledge frequency, you've got 1, 2, and 3, 1 being monthly, 2 being quarterly, and 3 being annual. So you have to get your data into this format. So if you're getting data from an external source, probably they won't be able to get it to you in this particular format. So you're going to have to do a lot of massaging of your data to get it into this format so that you can then import that. Now, when you do that import, it's going to go through the same sort of process that you saw with Gary, not quite so many options. This is quite an old program. While the one that Gary's mentioned is being continually updated with new features and facilities, this one essentially isn't. If I go into that in here, into the old read web program is what I've called it, very, very similar to what Gary showed you before. So you've got the data file, which is the text file, exactly what I had before, but of course you would have to remove the header row and then just save that as a text file. What campaign should it go into? What campaign, if it's a pledge, donor type and things like that for default setting up of donor records, is it banked already, all of those same sort of things that Gary did, except there's no check for duplicates via the email. And of course with web donations that would have been a nice thing to have, but certainly that's not there at the moment. Okay, I won't actually run through that, we are running out of time. I'll just briefly mention some other things. Some of the other programs that we have, we've got one for reading data from Cornucopia and another one from Good Cause. So these were external companies that did a lot of work trying to get people to sign up for your regular donation program, you know, monthly donors, and so these programs would allow you to read the data in from those places. If you deal with Apple telemarketing, Communication Direct or Smart Health, all of these are telemarketers. There are quite a number of different programs that can be used to import data from them. They will export it in a particular way that matches the various programs that we have. So with Apple telemarketing, it can read donors and donations, or it can read donors and raffle tickets. Similar sorts of things can be done for Communication Direct and for Smart Health. And finally, of course, we've talked about this on a number of occasions, but we have at the moment 3 peer-to-peer import programs where you can download the data from their websites and use one of these 3 programs. So that's it really. There are probably a number of other ones that have been done, but most of the other import programs that we have been specifically written for particular clients of ours. Now, if you have data that needs to be imported in into Donman, especially if we're talking about donations as well as donors, then if it's more than a one-off, massaging that data into the read web type format can be a real pain. If you're doing it every week or every month, you know, the amount of time that you spend doing that, and there's also the potential risk that you make a mistake. And if you put things in the wrong columns, it's going to import the data into the wrong spot. So if it's an ongoing type import that you need, our recommendation would be to actually get a quote to see how much it would cost for a program to be written. Because if the program is written specifically for the format of the data that you have, you would simply get the data from your external source and you would feed that into the program that's been written for you. You could have it do all sorts of things. If it finds a duplicate, you can ask if you want to update it, or whatever processing you want it to do, you can have it done. Of course, there is a cost associated with that, so that's obviously the downside to those things. But in the long run, in terms of being able to just do it quickly and without too much pain, a special program is probably the way to go. Okay, I'm going to hand it back to Marla now so that we can discuss any of the questions that have come in.
Thanks, Murray. A couple of questions have been posted, but just a reminder to anyone, we do have a few minutes left, so if you do have any questions, please post them in the question pane. That's in the, if you open the control panel with the orange grab tab arrow, you can fill in the details there. So just going back a bit for Gary and Murray, Maria just had a question on how do you back up files?
Okay, well, I guess there's 2 different ways. You can rely on your services, whoever you're with. You know, you probably have an IT department perhaps, and they would probably do nightly backups of your data, given that your data would exist on the actual server. So you would probably need to verify that the data is backed up nightly, or how often it is and how far back you need to go. So in most cases, you probably don't need to do a backup yourself. But if you're partway through the day, then as Gary mentioned, you can actually perhaps zip up your whole data directory under the DM work directory, or if you know that you're only going to be affecting particular files, like in the case of Gary where he's just importing perhaps donor records, you could actually just keep a backup copy of the relevant files. So in that case, if we're just updating the donor file, then there would be a file called donors.dat in the data directory under DM work. But again, I would suggest that rather than rely on that, perhaps you can talk to your IT people and they can set something up that can do a special backup for you. That way you're assured that you've got all the data that you need.
Okay. Renee has a question in regards to duplicates. Is there a quicker way to check duplicates? She said they often import hundreds at a time and sitting there checking each one as it imports is a long process.
So sadly, it's a long process either at that time or doing it after. There's no quick way to automatically have the duplicates, because as you saw when I did it, sometimes the name is similar but it's not the same, and sometimes it's spelled differently but it is the same person. So you can always say no, don't check for duplicates, and they will always show in the log files at the end of the import programs, and you can then from that say, okay, yes, I can now see they're the same people and do something about that. But at the end of the day, the time that you spend is going to be fairly much the same if you do it up front or if you do it after.
Okay, question from Lyndall. If you want to add an extra code to existing donors, how do you make sure it goes into the next empty extra code field? She's saying, for example, some donors might already have several extra codes, so you won't know whether extra code 1 or extra code 2 would be available.
No, normally if you're doing an extra code for a selection of people, you would have a selection file of the donors that you wanted to give the extra code to, and in Modify History under the bulk utilities, there is a program called Bulk Donor Code Update, which is designed specifically to update codes or change codes on donor records. And if you choose extra codes, it would by default find the first blank one and put the value in that you wanted to, because otherwise, yes, it is very tough.
Now there is actually, if you were wanting to assign a different extra code to different people, you can actually use the import append program, but what you have to do is you have to use something like visrep to export the donor number with all of the current extra codes, so that would be extra code 1 through to 8. Then in your spreadsheet you could add an extra column in front of that, which then becomes extra code 1, and all of the others then effectively get bumped along, so that the code that you want to import would then end up as the first one, and everything else would be bumped along 1. Now, of course, the downside to that is if someone's already got 8, then the 8th one is going to be bumped off the end, but there's not much we can do about that. So that would be one way to import different extra codes for different people.
Okay, that looks to be all of our questions for today, so thank you, Gary, and thank you, Murray. I'm just putting in the chat screen now for everyone that registration is open now for next month's webcast, which is exporting data from Donman, so following on from this month, and that's on Tuesday the 21st of October, at 2 p.m, and that's Australian Eastern Daylight Savings Time. So that is for any of our Brisbane, Queensland clients, that'll be 1 p.m. for you next month. All right, so we'll leave it there today. If anyone does have any further questions, I will leave the webcast open for a couple more minutes and you can post those questions and we can follow up with you offline with that. But thank you again for joining us today, and thank you, Gary and Murray, for another great webcast. Goodbye for now.
All right, bye everyone.
Bye, everybody.